The year 1917 was one of the most pivotal moments in Russian history, and it was marked by two major revolutions, the first in February, the second in October. During this year, we see that the nature of government, which is the purpose of this first topic of our discussion, shifted and changed dramatically. The monarchy, which had been ruled for over 300 years under the Tsarist Romanov dynasty, had been overthrown, and a temporary government structure emerged in its place. This is the period of the Provisional Government, which lasted from March to October 1917. This lesson is going to examine these events and think about how the nature and structure of government began to shift and began to change during the Russian Revolution and the subsequent events thereafter. The February Revolution in February-March 1917 begins in Petrograd, in St. Petersburg, modern-day St. Petersburg, and was caused by a number of issues, long-term and immediate. In terms of the immediate and long-term issues, we see that by 1917, Russia had faced severe economic difficulties. The First World War had drained the national resources of the Russian state. There was widespread food shortages, inflation, and disintegration of transport and supply systems. By early 1917, we see that inflation in the Russian Empire had reached over 300% in some specific urban areas, causing sharp decline in living standards, particularly for the working classes and for soldiers. Additionally, Russia's military losses in the war were beginning to become catastrophic. By February 1917, Russia had lost over 2 million men and had experienced widespread and large-scale discontent within the army. Many of the soldiers, who were largely conscripts, had become very weary of the conflict, very weary of the war, and many of them decided to defect or even to just desert in large numbers. All of this discontent among workers, especially within Petrograd, modern-day St. Petersburg, was beginning to grow. We see that in February 1917, after the announcement of bread shortages and bread rationings, that a series of strikes and protests began to erupt. In the first week of February, over 90,000 workers in Petrograd were on strike, and this number had swelled to over 200,000 by the 25th of February that year. The culmination of these protests meant that the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II was imminent. In fact, following a mutiny by soldiers in Petrograd, he abdicated on the 2nd of March 1917. The abdication ended more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule, but also decidedly left a power vacuum that led to the establishment of the Provisional Government. Now, the Provisional Government was formed on the 2nd of March 1917, the day of the abdication of Nicholas II. Its formation was the outcome of negotiations between the Russian Parliament, the Duma, which, as you remember from the previous lesson, and as the result of the October Manifesto, had very little power and authority over that of the autocratic Tsar, but it was a negotiations between the Duma and a group of political leaders, as well as the Council of Workers and Soldiers and Deputies, known as the Petrograd Soviet. The Petrograd Soviet wields considerable influence, and what carries on is a period of time in which we see the governance of a dual power structure, with the Provisional Government on the one hand and the Petrograd Soviet wielding power on the other. A number of key figures within this new provisional government included Prince Georgy Lvov, who was the first leader, or some might say chairman, of the provisional government. He was a liberal aristocrat and also a member of the Constitutional Democratic Party, the Cadets. Additionally, the initial Minister of War, Alexander Kerensky, later would become the head of the provisional government in July 1917. Kerensky was a more moderate socialist who played a very key role in trying and attempting to balance the interests of the liberals and the socialists, and also to act as the go-between between the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet. The provisional government itself had a number of aims and structural structural foundations. The provisional government was only ever intended to be a temporary system with the goal of organising elections for a newly established constituent assembly. This would be a body that would draft a new constitution for Russia, and namely do one without the fact that we have no longer got a monarch, and you therefore need to have a bit of a conversation about the power vacuum that existed at this particular point. The provisional government was initially composed of largely liberal and moderate socialist leaders who sought to implement a number of democratic reforms, but also, and problematically for the provisional government, maintain Russia's involvement in the First World War. Its major aims outside of its involvement in the First World War included political liberalization, land reform, and freedom of speech and assembly. In practice, though, the provisional government was weak. The government shared power with the Petrograd Soviet, and this led to a parallel authority which was largely made up of representatives of radical workers as socialist deputies. The division became the dual power structure that existed, and it created an unstable and ineffective government structure, as both the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet both claimed legitimacy as being representative of the people. But it was more so the policies of the provisional government that was most problematic for its success. The first of these, of course, was the fact that we see a continuation of the war. The provisional government's first major policy was to continue the war against Germany and its allies. Despite the widespread desire for peace, the government made no attempt to negotiate peace with Germany, instead committing to a military offensive in June 1917. This is either known as the Kerensky Offensive or the June Offensive, but it was a decision that led to disastrous military defeats and caused further disillusionment among soldiers and civilians. The Kerensky offensive itself resulted in massive losses for the Russian army. By the end of July 1917, the Russian army had lost a further 400,000 men to the offensive, and many soldiers began to just simply desert in large numbers. In addition, you still have the fact that there are major economic problems in actually being able to fund the war. The inflation, bread shortages, food shortages, all of these things were continuing to be problematic for the Russian Empire. The provisional government also sought to make promises when it came to land reforms, but it was unable to ever implement any of them in an effective manner. Peasants, who made up around 80% of the Russian population at this time, had long been demanding greater land redistribution. The government, however, failed to take concrete action to address this issue, and instead wanted to defer the issue to the Constituent Assembly that they believed would be created after the provisional government. The provisional government decided it was going to try and introduce a number of democratic reforms. So it, for example, abolished censorship and granted political freedoms, and released a number of political prisoners. These reforms, however, were still very much insufficient to quell the growing dissatisfaction. Remember that these are all really good policies, civil liberties and thinking about land reform and land redistribution, but none of these policies can really stand up to the fact that they wanted to continue the war effort, and the Kerensky offensive was a further disastrous defeat on the part of the Russian state. And so it didn't really matter how much freedom of speech and how many political prisoners were freed if the war was going to continue, which the provisional government sought to ensure that it would. And in addition to this, because of the dual power structure, the Petrograd Soviet then became a very significant counterbalance, not just to a kind of separation of powers, but more so to the government's authority, the provisional government's authority. As the power of the Soviet was beginning to grow, particularly after it gained control over a number of military units and railway networks, we can see that it begins to undermine the authority of the provisional government. In June 1917, for example, the Soviet began issuing orders that conflicted with that of the provisional government, and it therefore started to exacerbate the crisis of the dual power structure. An example of this is by summer 1917, we can see over 2 million soldiers and workers' councils had pledged loyalty to the Soviet, and this strengthened the position of the rival government and made the provisional government far weaker than that of the authority of the Soviet. All of this means that as we start to decline into the final period of the provisional government, its power begins to erode, and there are several factors which contribute to its downfall. The first is the failure to end the First World War. The fact that they continued to involve themselves in the war with the Kerensky offensive meant that the provisional government was automatically very unpopular. The Russian army's growing disintegration, mass desertions, and growing hunger and poverty among civilians continued to lead to greater protests among the population. Between the 3rd and the 7th of July 1917, we get what are known as the July Days. This was a spontaneous collection of uprisings of workers and soldiers in Petrograd, influenced by Bolshevik agitation. And what it did was it saw protests against the provisional government. The Bolsheviks, who were the radical socialist group within the Russian state at the time, initially took part in the protests, but what Kerensky did was respond by cracking down. The uprising was suppressed, but it exposed quite significantly the fragility of the provisional government. And so the question of growth, when we think about the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, meant that we can see that he began to gain greater and greater support from workers, soldiers, and peasants, and the Bolsheviks began to advocate for a number of more popular policies than that of the provisional government. Vladimir Lenin famously in April issued his April Thesis, which was the advocacy for, quote, peace, land, and bread. Now, while this slogan wasn't necessarily popular enough for Lenin to take control in April, he was eventually exiled again, it still was a slogan that resonated with the masses, who were disillusioned with the provisional government's failure to meet their basic needs. And so by October 1917, we can see that the Bolsheviks had gained a majority within the Petrograd Soviet, as well as the lesser aforementioned Moscow Soviet. And their influence in the military and workers' councils was beginning to grow at a rapid pace. All of this culminates then in the October Revolution in October 1917. This was when the provisional government is on the brink of collapse. Lenin then, after returning to Russia from exile, caused for an armed insurrection to overthrow the Bolshevik government. We can see that the Bolshevik Revolution begins on the 25th of October, and we see the storming of the Winter Palace in Petrograd. The Bolshevik Red Guards took control over a number of key institutions, such as telegraph offices, railways, and post offices, effectively rendering the provisional government powerless. On the morning of the 26th, the day after, the provisional government had been dissolved, and an all-Russian Congress of Soviets recognized the Bolshevik government as being the true superior institution. Lenin was appointed as the new head of this government, and the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was established. This marked the beginning of Bolshevik rule within the Russian system and within the Soviet Union. The next lesson is going to focus on the Russian Civil War, which follows immediately after this period of time, and then think about the rise of Stalin. And we'll then start thinking about the totalitarian regime and authoritarian regime under the Stalinist project, before thinking about the reign of Nikita Khrushchev.